My grandfather was the custodian of the rural public school I attended growing up. Like many black men of his time who grew up in a segregated and Jim Crow South, he couldn't read or write well. But I was so proud of my grandfather, and I loved the fact that I got to see him every day at school. At that young age, I was unaware of the different status privileges that people attach to others based on the type of job they held or their race. It didn't even bother me that I had to help my grandfather clean classrooms after school, because it meant that when I was finished, my brother and I could go to the school gym and we could play with the other kids who were staying after school waiting on their parents to finish their work. But there's one day in middle school that I will never forget, and that was the day that I realized that I was black. My brother and I had finished helping our grandfather, so we had gone to the gym and we started playing basketball with another white brother team, a point that had always been irrelevant to me up until this day. We were putting all the moves on them, just beating them badly, when the youngest brother stopped mid-court and out of the blue yelled at me, "Give me the ball, you black boy." And just like that, it seemed that everything had stopped. Then it sped back up, because before I knew it, I was choking that boy. His brother ran out of the gym, probably to get their mother, and my brother, who was equally as shocked as I was, finally snapped out of the trance that he was in and pulled me off of him. Now, it's not like we grew up not seeing color, because we did. And he actually said a true statement. I was a black boy. And don't get me wrong, I love being black. But it was the way that he said to me, "You black boy." That was the first time in my life that I realized that to some people, there was something wrong with being black, and that they saw being black as inferior. Or in other words, they saw me as inferior to them. At that young age, I couldn't understand why some people would think that way. But as I got older, I not only learned more about anti-black racism academically, but I also experienced more of the harsh realities of how anti-black racism manifests in America. Black America was still suffering from the chain of other high-profile police shootings when in May 2020, we witnessed yet another one when George Floyd was murdered, leaving us with those eerily familiar last words of, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe." There were a lot of things that bothered me about how some people and organizations responded to this tragic event. But what I found most curious is that so many people saw these acts of racism solely within the realms of police brutality. That is, they understood how racism kills black people through police brutality, but they didn't see the other less conspicuous ways that racism kills. And moreover, they didn't see themselves as perpetrators of that racism. Though disappointing, this is actually not a surprise to me, because as a researcher, I've studied discrimination, bias, and oppression for over a decade. And I've written specifically about the many ways that racism kills black people. But here today, I will just share with you two of the less conspicuous ways. It is my hope that greater awareness of the less conspicuous ways that racism kills would serve as a starting point for people who not only want to see a positive change in our society, but who also want to be that positive change in our society. The first less conspicuous way that racism kills black people is the perennial expectation that black people absolve others for their racism. We saw this happen the same day George Floyd was murdered, when a white woman called 911 and lied to the dispatcher, stating that an African-American man was threatening her, knowing full well the power of her white womanhood and the imminent danger a black man would be in from a police call using this language. In reality, he only asked her to leash her dog, which was a requirement in the area of Central Park they were in. So she became known as Central Park Karen. You see, the weaponization of white femininity happens so often that Black America even has a name for it: Karen. We saw it happen when a white man walked into a South Carolina AME church during a Bible study meeting and later murdered the non-Black church parishioners in cold blood. And he was brought Burger King food to eat while he was in police custody. We saw it happen when a white woman was on trial for killing her neighbor, Botham Jean, while he was just sitting in his own apartment. Coming off the stand, the victim's brother and the judge both gave her a hug, the judge even giving her the Bible from her chambers. In all of these cases, the calls to forgive those white people were swift. And just like clockwork, forgiveness came. It doesn't matter how much pain we are in or the outcomes we face due to this racism. America demands us to forgive and forget so we can move on as business as usual. But as legendary activist Malcolm X reminds us, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6, there's no progress. If you pull it out all the way, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. So the next time you see people urging Black people to absolve and forgive others for their racism so that they can quickly jump to the happy Hallmark ending that they expect and are comfortable with, stop them. And make sure the perpetrators are actually held accountable for their racist behavior and advocate for the appropriate restitution to Black people to heal the blow. The second less conspicuous way racism kills Black people is through performative activism and allyship. Now, typically, you can tell if something is performative if there is some constellation of these 3 factors. 1, if there is an absence of a legitimate track record from the person or organization. 2, if there's a mismatch between behavior and activism goals. And 3, if there is some presence of some self-interested gains. Take, for example, when Colin Kaepernick took a knee to protest anti-Black racism, he ended up losing his job in the NFL. But after organizations jumped on the 2020 wave of racial reckoning, instead of hiring him back and addressing their own internal racial inequity issues, the NFL decided to play the Black national anthem at the start of games. Like, who asked for that? The leaders at Twitter decided to make Juneteenth a corporate holiday. Now, that's a good start and all, but what about that edit tweet feature we've been asking about for forever? And if that's too much to ask, what about social media companies quickly shutting down the accounts of people who spew white supremacy across their social media platforms? And as a final example, Walmart, the largest retailer in the world, pledged to stop locking up their multicultural hair and beauty supplies in their display cases. Really, Walmart? Of all of the things you could have chosen to advance racial justice, you chose this one as your pledge? How about just stop profiling Black customers as they shop in your stores? Or perhaps, how about pay all of your full-time store associates, many of whom are women and people of color, adequate living wages so they wouldn't have to rely on government assistance just to make ends meet? These are just a small sample of the many ways in which people and organizations have engaged in performative activism and allyship. Now, some of you may ask, isn't doing some good better than doing nothing? Well, if the good that you're doing is performative, then it's not good at all. Performative activism and allyship is particularly nefarious because it diverts attention and resources away from legitimate people, causes, and organizations who are doing the real work to advance racial justice. And it maintains the status quo, or worse, exacerbates the oppression that vulnerable communities are already experiencing. The research on minority stress, discrimination, and identity threat is clear on the many ways racism negatively impacts Black people's mental, emotional, and physical health. Some people call it death by 1,000 cuts. And what is also clear to me is if we frame this moment of racial reckoning, this moment that some people are calling the twin pandemics, only as a police brutality issue, and overlook all of the less conspicuous ways that racism kills, we will fail miserably on moving the needle on eliminating racism in our society, and more Black people will die. Now, my grandfather, who was my last surviving grandparent, passed away when I was in college, meaning that none of my grandparents lived long enough to see any of their children or grandchildren graduate from college. Like all of you, I want to see my grandchildren graduate from college and beyond, but I need your help to do it. Thank you.